Now, let me introduce the two speakers today. It's Amanda Lanigan and Andy Felon, and they are both Peace Fellows in the second year. And as part of their studies and internship this semester, they have been working with Global Peace Index. So they will share some of their findings and thoughts with us and get feedback. Amanda has a background in education and non-profit sectors. She has worked with community leaders and social services for underserved populations. She has a bachelor's in history. And Andy has an interest in restorative justice programs, both in after violent conflict, but also within educational legal structures in areas which are not in conflict. He has a master's in theology. So let me hand over to Andy and Amanda, and questions can be asked in the chat or afterwards. If they finish in time, we'll spend the last 10 minutes to pick up questions and comments. I guess that's it. Can I hand over to one of you then, or both actually, but I don't know who is starting off. So over to you guys, and we plan to have this finished by 14:45. So keep that in mind as you do your presentation.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Tore. I want to thank all of you firstly for taking some time out of your afternoon and listening to our presentation. So as Tore shared, I'm here with my colleague and friend, Amanda. We're both Rotary Peace Fellows. And as part of our fellowship, we're offered an opportunity to do a short training with the Institute of Economics and Peace, based out of Sydney, but with offices in many places. And their function is to come up with innovative ways to measure peace, with the basic rationale that if you can't measure peace, you don't know if your interventions are working, you don't understand trends, you don't know if the world, your country or your region or your locality is getting more or less peaceful. If you can't measure it, you're kind of just walking blind. So measuring peace is a very important thing, and it's a very difficult thing. So today we're going to talk about the Institute of Economics and Peace's efforts to measure peace in the Global Peace Index. I will give some basics about what this index is and what its function is, but then we'll attempt to answer a question that we thought was a little interesting. Since we're in Sweden, we thought we would focus on Scandinavia and look at slight variations, small but important variations in Scandinavian peace. And we also really appreciate all of your input. If you think we're wrong, just tell us, and we'd love to hear that. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So what is the Global Peace Index? It's basically a tool to measure peace. It's a quantitative tool. It uses 23 indicators, so it's a pretty complex tool. When you come up with an index or measurement like this with something ambiguous or nebulous like peace, it's always subjective. And you can be very critical of it, and I think that's important. But before we go into how the index works, I think it's important to talk about how this NGO defines peace. Peace is traditionally defined in the negative, so as the absence of conflict or the absence of the fear of conflict. You can also define peace in the positive with the presence of something, so like the presence of social justice or the presence of institutions, attitudes, or systems that kind of bind societies together, countries together, regions together, and make them more resilient to conflict. So there's many different ways to define peace, and because of this, there's many different ways to measure peace. Now, the Institute of Economics and Peace does it kind of in both ways. They have a Global Peace Index, which is a complex measure of peace in the negative. So it's measuring violence and conflict in many different ways. They also have a Positive Peace Index, which is measuring those binding elements in society, which make it resilient to conflict. Both are important measurements, both are valid, but it's just important that how you the indicators that you use make sense. So again, it's all very subjective, but it's important that you try so you can have reliable trend lines. Now, let's see. As I shared, today we're going to look at the Global Peace Index, which is this sort of negative definition. It's looking at measuring actual violence and conflict. So it's the absence of violence is what we're looking for. Now, it does this through a number of indicators, but they're really three separate pots. So one pot is domestic and international conflict. So here you can think of indicators that are like the relations with countries, how many people died in a conflict, the intensity of conflicts. They have another pot, which is societal safety and security. So here you can think measurements about crime, more internal societal things like homicide rates or terrorism or incarceration rates. Then they have a third pot, which is militarization. So here you can think the number of weapons exports, weapons imports. You can also think of military expenditure as a function of GDP. So these types of indicators are sort of like, they come up with this complex number that allows you to rank all the countries in the world and say which ones, in their opinion, are the most and least peaceful. And they've been doing this for 14 years, so you can see trend lines in both countries, individual peace, and global peace. Now, so when you go to the website of the Institute of Economics and Peace, which I think is Vision of Humanity or visionforhumanity.org, sorry, you can look at the specific numbers of each country. You can look at each individual indicator over time, but there's also this kind of simple color gradation of peace that gives you a really simple overview of which countries, in their opinion, are the most and least peaceful for any given year. Now, Sweden and Norway are consistently very peaceful countries. However, they are surrounded by countries that have the highest level of peace in Finland, Denmark, and Iceland. It's really hard to be ranked in that dark green color that you see on my screen. It's very hard as well to be in the lighter green color. You know, the country that Amanda and I come from, the United States, is not that. And we're very cognizant of the fact that we come from a country that, according to these indicators, is very violent. However, since we're in Sweden, we thought it'd be interesting to explore why is Norway and Sweden a slightly less, kind of relatively less peaceful country than some of its neighbors. Now, as you can see in my screen, here's a ranking of the top 28 most peaceful countries in 2020. Sweden and Norway are doing really well. The scale is from 1 to 5, and they're right at 1.5 and below. They're doing exceptionally well. However, Norway is doing very well. They're top 5. Or sorry, Denmark is doing very well. They're top 5. And our question is why? What differs those 10 plus spots? Why is Sweden and Norway relatively less peaceful than Denmark? So we thought it might be interesting, if we have enough time, for you guys to give us your gut instincts. Why do you think that Denmark is doing so much better and consistently does better than Norway and Sweden? So let's see if this works. We'll be quick, but if you can write in the chat box, if you see it, what are your reasons for why you think there's a relative difference here? And maybe Amanda or Tore can share any responses in the chat, since I'm looking at my screen here. So take 30 minutes to a minute and write in the chat why you think, with a little bit I shared, or your own history and experiences, why Sweden and Norway are relatively less peaceful. Tore, do you mind sharing? Or Amanda?
Someone just shared. It would be less challenging to answer if we get the analysis leading to the differences in colors. That's a great point, and I think what we're kind of looking for is kind of your gut reaction. You know, without the data points and things, what's your gut reaction as to why? And of course, we're going to go more in depth about this. So if you want to sit tight and don't really have a thought right now, that's completely fine too. Maybe we'll take about 30 more seconds to see if anyone has a response. And Bjorn has shared that I've already given him a hint, so he will be quiet. Stefan shared Sweden probably has more criminal activities, shootings, bombs, etc. than Denmark and Finland. Torre has brought up the arms trade. All interesting thoughts. Any other thoughts?
I think I'll go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for sharing, everyone.
So those are good answers. I think it's important to break it down and look at the specifics. What are the relative differences here? So I mentioned earlier, there's 3 different pots of indicators. So the domestic and international conflict, the societal safety and security, which is like crime, and then the militarization. Now, when you look at the variation across Scandinavia, and right now, just looking at Norway, Sweden, and Denmark on this chart, you can see that their domestic and international conflict scores are very close. So there's very little variation. Then this is scores between 1 and 5. And then you can see in the societal safety and security indicators that there's some variation, but they are fairly close. I think it's important to break this down. When you look at the specific indicators of societal safety and security, you actually see a lot of balance. So Denmark, for example, has higher homicide and incarceration rates than Sweden, consistently. However, Sweden has slightly higher violent crime, but they all have the same perceived level of crime in society. So yes, you can see in this chart, Sweden is has slightly higher scores in societal safety and security, which makes them less peaceful there. But the variation, in our opinion, is minimal, though meaningful. The militarization pot of indicators, however, has the greatest variation. You can see that Norway has a 2.37, Sweden has a 1.79, and Denmark has a 1.31. So here, really, we're trying to explain very small variations in peace. And we believe that the data indicates that the militarization scores explain more of the relative distance between Denmark and then Sweden and Norway. Now, when we look in this a little bit more deeply, if you break down the militarization indicators, so right now we're just looking at indicators that are a part of the militarization pot. So I included 3 indicators here that really, I think, illustrate the variation. I've colored in red the kind of higher levels. So you can see that Norway is a huge weapons importer. They have one of the higher scores globally. And Sweden and Norway also have very high weapons exports scores. Here I included Iceland and Finland just for fun, to give you some context. It's important to recognize Iceland is consistently the most peaceful country in the world, so it's a bit of an anomaly. And Finland, though it is generally scores a little bit better than Sweden and Norway, it's comparable. However, the huge outliers with Sweden and Norway are weapons imports and weapons exports. And in the GPI index, it's these bolded red numbers that kind of create this distance between the 5th place of Denmark and the still good but lower 15th and 17th places of Norway and Sweden. Now, there's a line in the Global Peace Index's 2020 report that I just wanted to read. Weapons exports remain highly concentrated, with 73 countries registering no exports at all, for the period of 2003 to 2019. A number of otherwise highly peaceful countries also performed poorly on this indicator, with Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands all being ranked among the 10 highest weapons exporters per capita for every year in the last 5 years. Now, it's important to recognize that these weapons imports and exports numbers are all relative to the population. So again, Amanda and I are very mindful that we come from the United States. If you look at, and Amanda will in a second go into much deeper illustration of this, we're cognizant the United States accounts for about 1/3 of all weapons exports in the world. Sweden is much smaller than that. But relative to the population size, Sweden's numbers are frankly high. Now, Amanda will continue the presentation with arms exports in the Swedish peace.
Hey everyone, I hope you can all hear me. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So yeah, again, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I do, again, want to note that Andy and I both acknowledge that being from the United States, we are by far the biggest culprits of arms exports. However, we felt it was interesting to examine the ranking of Sweden on the GPI index in relation to Sweden's arms exports. And what I'm seeking to examine is how Sweden's arms exports behaviors actually at times contradict and detract from Swedish foreign policy goals. So the first thing we're going to look at are some import and export trends. Andy, if you don't mind changing the slide, thank you. So as we've shown before, or discussed a little bit before, Sweden is consistently one of the top arms exporters in the world. And SIPRI, an organization based in Stockholm that perhaps some of you have heard about, consistently ranks it in one of the top 15. Now, Sweden has a number of countries that it trades with, and most of the trade is going to what's called traditional partner countries, such as the United States, South Africa, and Canada, and also the EU. But for the purposes of this presentation and an examination of the ways in which arms exports might possibly detract from Swedish foreign policy goals, I wanted to look at some of the other major trading partners that Sweden is exporting with. So some of those countries of note are countries like the UAE, India, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia. So there's a couple sectors that Sweden's engaged in exportation through. Most of the exports are aerospace and communication, but there's also short-range weapons and armored vehicles. And again, when we look at these kind of non-traditional partner countries such as the UAE, India, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia, we are going to see that these sectors play a huge role in, again, at times detracting from Swedish foreign policy goals as these exports go on. And I think it's also important to note that in terms of small arms, so these are kind of smaller handheld weapons, et cetera, that are still used in warfare and also in kind of more domestic conflicts, Sweden is also generally classified as a major exporter. So if we go to the next slide, you'll kind of get a more global view. And again, you'll see that the top kind of 5 exporters, if we're looking at the USA, Russia, China, France, Germany, they really completely dwarf Sweden. And again, we're acknowledging that Sweden is not playing a major kind of global role in this, but our goal is to examine how do these arms exports detract from Sweden's foreign policy goals. So the first things I want to go over are some of the standards and norms that govern Swedish arms exports. And of course, if you guys have questions about this or comments, I'm happy to take them at the end, because certainly you're all the experts on the Swedish standards and norms, but this is what I was able to find through my research. So what I found that was very interesting is that much of Sweden's arms exportation industry is actually kind of centered on Swedish neutrality. So because Sweden has taken a stance of neutrality, Sweden wants to avoid dependence on other countries when it comes to a need to defend itself. So the goal is to build up an arms industry to avoid this dependence. And much of this building up and much of the financing of this arms industry is done through exportation. So it's actually arms exports that allow Sweden to have a very robust arms industry that then contributes to its neutrality. Now, as a neutral actor, Sweden is consistently called on as kind of a peacemaker in global conflicts. And what we're going to see later on in this presentation is several examples where Sweden's arms exports actually detract from this reputation as a neutral kind of peacemaker. It's also important to note we're going to see a lot of individual companies engaging in arms exports from Sweden. Is key in facilitating these deals and these exports. And there's a number of Swedish laws and regulations that are in place to try and make sure that these exports fall in line with Swedish norms and standards. So the first is the Swedish Military Equipment Act. And basically what this says is that arms exports are only permitted if they're necessary to meet Swedish defense needs. There's also national Swedish guidelines, which talk about consideration for human rights, involvement in internal or international conflicts, or the presence of situations that could lead to internal or international conflict or internal armed disturbances. So all of this is important to note as we go further and look at some examples, because again, Swedish arms exports are only supposed to occur if they're necessary to meet Swedish defense needs. But because of this kind of neutrality goal and the need to build up the Swedish arms industry, pretty much any Swedish arms export can be cited as something that's necessary to build up this arms industry and maintain neutrality and meet these defense needs. So just an important context as we move forward. There's also a number of international laws and regulations that Sweden is privy to and has signed on to when it comes to arms exports. So these are other kind of standards that are supposed to be considered as Sweden moves forward when examining arms exports or engaging in arms exports. So the first is a UN Program of Action on Small Arms. As I noted before, Sweden is consistently ranked as one of the top small arms exporters. However, according to this protocol, major exporters of small arms are supposed to ensure that the bodies that hold these arms adhere to certain standards of security and safety. There's also the Arms Trade Treaty, which means that any nation with an arms embargo, an act of genocide, or grave violations of the Geneva Convention should not be receiving arms exports from any outside country. There's also a provision for serious gender-based violence in this Arms Trade Treaty, which is of note to Sweden as a country with a feminist foreign policy. Finally, there's the EU Code of Conduct, which focuses on human rights, international law, internal situations in the country, and socioeconomic factors, as well as regional peace. So again, when we look at the following examples, I want us all to kind of keep this in mind. Is the arms export behavior of Sweden really adhering to these code of conducts and standards and regulations that we see here? And we'll see how that unfolds. So most of Sweden's arms exports deals, again, kind of center around balancing interests. And what we've seen through our research is kind of two conflicting sort of interests here. We have the interest of Swedish national security and human security. Now, although we see that those seem to kind of be polarizing, in reality, if they're looked at as kind of with a kind of holistic approach, we can see that in order to have national security, Sweden also needs to consider human security as it engages in arms exports. Now, currently, this is not really the case. In order for Sweden to reject an arms export deal, human rights violations have to be grave and widespread, and they're really narrowly defined. However, larger security interests are defined more broadly, which kind of gives a little bit more room to engage in arms exportation. So in practice, arms exports can almost always be justified in light of Swedish national security interests, unless there's this big kind of unconditional factor in place, such as a genocide or an arms embargo. Another thing I wanted to highlight before I get into the examples is the Swedish foreign policy itself. So again, Sweden is a very active player around the world as a peacemaker and often called in when it comes time to negotiate a peace or a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Sweden also has a stated feminist foreign policy goal. This feminist foreign policy centers around promoting the rights of girls and women, combating violence and discrimination, promoting women's influence in decision-making, and making sure that countries are allocating resources to promote gender equality. And as we consider these two roles, Sweden as the peacemaker and Sweden as kind of a feminist foreign policy driven, we need to look very critically at the impact of weapons exports. So I'm going to go through a series of examples that I think illustrate how arms exports can sometimes detract from Swedish foreign policy goals. Again, I want to acknowledge that this is not the majority of Swedish arms exports. These are key examples from about 22% of the total arms trade of Sweden. Most of Swedish arms trade is going to traditional partner countries and EU countries where most of the standards and norms of arms exportation and guidelines that I mentioned before are met. However, there are some key examples where we can see that Swedish arms exports are actively detracting from Swedish foreign policy. So the first example I wanted to talk about was Libya. During the Libyan civil war, Sweden actively participated in a no-fly zone over the country of Libya. However, while that was taking place, both sides of the civil war were receiving arms from abroad despite a UN arms embargo. And some of those weapons were actually coming from Sweden. The Swedish anti-aircraft artillery systems were used by the Libyan army, and other weapons were supplied by the UAE, which is a major importer of Swedish arms. Now, I think it's important here to note that the international and national guidelines governing weapons exports for Sweden call for a focus on regional security. And in the case of Libya and the UAE, we can see that regional security was ignored as these arms exports were in play, because we can see that trading with the UAE and then the secondary use of these weapons by the Libyan army had detracted from regional security. It should also be noted that the UAE is actively involved in Yemen, where Sweden was involved in peace negotiations. Now, this example is a little bit older, but I felt it was really important to highlight. When the war between Iran and Iraq was going on, the Swedish Prime Minister was actively involved in UN mediations to bring an end to this war. Yet at the same time, Swedish company Bofors was sending explosives and gunpowder to Iran via the former German Democratic Republic. Furthermore, Bofors was also shipping weapons to Iraq and other Persian Gulf countries before, during, and after these negotiations. So here is yet another case where we can see that Sweden's active role of peacemaker is being undermined by arms exportation. Now, Bofors is its own company. However, as explained before, Sweden has a number of laws and regulations that are supposed to be in play to prevent Swedish companies from engaging in this type of kind of arms exportation. Now, I think one of the most grievous examples of this is the example of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of Sweden's biggest, or was one of Sweden's biggest customers. And Saudi Arabia is also involved actively in the conflict in Yemen. So in 2015, Sweden ended military cooperation with Saudi Arabia, but this did not end arms exports. Now, fast forward to 2018, we had Sweden's foreign minister, Margaret Wallström, actively involved in the negotiation of the Stockholm Agreement, which is where Yemen's foreign minister of the Hadi government came to meet with the Houthi senior representative. They signed this agreement, and it was believed that some promise of stability was on the horizon for this country and for this devastating humanitarian crisis in Yemen. However, the agreement failed, and a lot of this failure was due to continuous bombing from Saudi Arabia and UAE. Now, where are Saudi Arabia and UAE getting the weapons to continue this bombing? Well, in some cases, it was from Sweden. In 2019, it was revealed that Saab's radar and combat management system, as well as the Swedish ship marine patrol boats, were utilized in these campaigns in Yemen. And also, the ERI radar system was used in Saudi-led attacks in Yemen. So again, we can see an example where arms exports are actively detracting from Swedish peacemaking efforts. Now, another example that goes back a little bit and continues into today is India. Olof Palme, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, has a wonderful legacy of promoting nuclear disarmament and peacemaking around the world. However, this legacy is slightly tarnished by an investigation that revealed that during disarmament talks with India, during talks designed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world, the Prime Minister was actively using these talks to promote purchases of weapons from Swedish companies. Now, this was a pretty big scandal from what I can gather from the Swedish media sources that I found. However, SIPRI reports that India remains one of the biggest importers of Swedish weapons. And although this scandal is past, recently this statistic has become a little bit more concerning. In 2019, Pakistan and India engaged in cross-border conflict, and on both sides, Swedish weapons were utilized in this conflict. Now, beyond the peacemaker role, if we think about Sweden's role as a feminist foreign policy actor, if we look at the UN report on violence against women, India is frequently cited as a country where state security forces using weapons purchased by the state frequently engage in violence against women through arbitrary detention, ill treatment, attacks on protesters, and especially attacks on women and innocent protesters in the militarized region of Kashmir. So again, we can see Sweden actively trading with a country that's in direct violation of Swedish foreign policy. Another two examples that I felt were pretty important were the examples of Indonesia and Namibia. In 2013, a Swedish report on Indonesia revealed that in some regions, women lacked access to very basic rights and also healthcare. It also cited Indonesia for failing to allocate resources to these two really important aspects of women's empowerment. Now, despite this fact, and despite the stated foreign policy goal of encouraging equal resource distribution for women and to promote the power of women, Sweden continues to export weapons to Indonesia. Now, another case that I found really interesting was the case of Namibia. A Swedish report on Namibia, which was collaborated by a later Canadian report, revealed that there are high levels of murder or threat by murder via small firearms for women facing domestic abuse. So oftentimes, women in situations of domestic abuse find themselves threatened by their spouses using small arms, such as hunting rifles, which is really common, or even murdered by their spouses, again, using these hunting arms. Now, who is the major supplier of hunting and small arms ammunition to Namibia? Sweden. So again, we can see where arms exports are detracting from Sweden's feminist foreign policy. So as we look to the future, there's a lot of kind of interesting developments as we examine Swedish arms exports. So Sweden and Germany and the entire EU actually began to cancel contracts with Saudi Arabia after the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It's important to note that the United States, however, under the leadership of Donald Trump, kind of rejected this idea and allowed the murder to kind of continue to happen with impunity. So it's really important to note that Sweden and other EU countries have taken like a moral stance against Saudi Arabia in this case. Now, recent law in Sweden has also moved forward to increase the military budget to 1.5% of the GDP. The goal here is to increase the size of armed forces and modernize systems. And this emerged after reports that Sweden only had enough artillery and kind of weapons and resources to defend itself for a week. So this recent law, I think, could kind of go two ways when we look at exports. On the one hand, exports are there to kind of bolster the defense industry. So perhaps as more money is spent on from the Swedish budget on the military, there'll be less need for exports. Or it could go the other way and actually lead to more exports as the Swedish arms industry becomes more robust. But something that I found interesting about this law was that Sweden had such a limited amount of artillery and ammunition on hand for its own defense. And yet this arms export kind of model was designed to bolster the Swedish arms industry. So I do see a little bit of disconnect between the arms exportation model and this desire to bolster the number of weapons and things like that and arms that Sweden has to defend itself, because as was shown by the report that discussed this recent law, Sweden didn't have a huge cache of weapons available for defense. Another thing that I think is important to consider is the link to migration. In 2019, the chairman of the Left Party called for a ban on arms sales to Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to facilitate an end to the conflicts in the region and alleviate the displacement crisis. As we know, Sweden has been hugely welcoming to refugees and migrants from conflicted part of the world. And thus, Sweden has seen firsthand the horrors that conflict causes and the grave human rights violations and just the moral wrongness of conflict. And I think it's important to kind of look at this through the lens of migration, especially as Sweden grapples with emerging opposition to migration. It's important to recognize that Sweden, in some small sense, through arms exportation, has played a role in the increase in conflicts that lead to migration itself. Again, as someone from the United States, I recognize that the Swedish role is such a small ratio in comparison to the United States role, but it's important to consider as we grapple with these issues moving forward. And just to kind of build on that, in 2001, there was a small investigation into the Swedish Space Organization, and it had been revealed that that they had been actively trying to sell surveillance equipment to Muammar Gaddafi. And one of the reasons cited was to reduce migration. So we can kind of see how all these themes come into play.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Amanda, for all of those examples. I just want to share some brief concluding remarks. So, militarization matters. We've shared that Sweden and Norway are in the top 20 most peaceful countries in the world, according to the GPI, and that is impressive and notable. However, we've also shared that their relatively high militarization score explain much of the distance between their position of 15th and 17th and Denmark's top 5 position. We've specifically showed the data behind weapons imports and export scores and how that really it has high explanatory value. Also, we've shared sort of this balance between Swedish national security interests and human security. I think Amanda shared that pretty well. I won't go into any more depth. One of our main points here, though, is Swedish arms sales can undermine Sweden's own peace-building efforts. And I think the conflict in Yemen is a prime example. As Amanda shared, the vast majority of Swedish weapons exports go to kind of quote-unquote safe countries. However, there is a small, significant, important minority, I think she said 22%, which perhaps deserves more attention. And that's what we sought to shine a little bit of light on today. We want to thank you for your time, for being willing to hear us today. And we are happy to answer any questions or receive any criticism that you might have.